final webinar of this program season, Fostering Expressions of Forgiveness Among Those Experiencing Military Moral Injury. I'm Nancy Ramsay, the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. This center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families affected by military moral injury. Our mission includes offering free monthly webinars that further that mission with a focus on topics that have been inadequately covered or not yet addressed. We're grateful for the support of the Shea Center on Moral Injury at Volunteers of America, which co-sponsors these webinars. I want to remind you that all our webinars are posted as links on this site and at the VOA YouTube channel. Ordinarily, the link is available within 10 days. In the case of today, you'll also find there references cited by the three presenters. As I mentioned, this webinar is the final one for this program season. We will pause for the summer, knowing that many of you will be busy during those months as well. We will resume our webinar series September 28th, 2021 at 2 p.m. with a focus on caring for male survivors of military sexual trauma. We invite you to mark that date on your calendars. We are very pleased to present today's webinar, which will be a conversation among three persons exceedingly qualified to help us reflect on the relationship between experiences of military moral injury and a journey with the meaning and how to listen for the very possibility of experiences of forgiveness. And we'll also discuss practices of care. Our panelists include Professor Shelly Rambo, the Reverend Dr. Michael Yandell, and Navy Chaplain and Professor Chris Hansen. I will serve as moderator for this webinar. Our chat monitor is Kyle Fauntleroy, a development officer at Brite and a retired captain in the U.S. Navy Chaplain Corps. Kyle is a founding member of the National Advisory Board, and he will prioritize questions you direct to him for our panelists. We are also grateful to Sam McAllister at VOA, who is managing this production. Today, our webinar will have a more informal chat format with each of the three presenters making initial remarks, and then the three of them will engage in conversation, which will take us to approximately 3 p.m. Eastern. As moderator, I will join them around 3, and I will bring questions that you pose directly to Kyle Fauntleroy via the chat. Again, please remember that the link to this webinar and attached bibliographies of works referenced will be available at our site in about 10 days. So let's get started. And we look forward, first of all, to hearing from Chaplain Hansen.
Thank you very much, Nancy. In 2017, I was a chaplain assigned with Naval Special Warfare, and I deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, where the mission of the operators was to support the Iraqi forces in clearing Western Mosul from ISIS. What was unique about that deployment was it was kinetic enough where it brought back memories of the service members to share with myself and others from previous deployments, but there was also enough downtime for some of those conversations. What struck me was that while some remembered a specific instance of a moral event that transgressed their deeply held moral values, for a lot of them, it was a mixture. One operator in specific I can think of, he told me about how this was his 4th or 5th combat deployment. He said he was starting to lose track. Through the time, he'd become a little bit jaded, where he felt a level of betrayal from the institution, from leadership, from missions, and why they were even there and why they were working with the Iraqi forces, following Jonathan Shea's understanding of betrayal. But he also felt like at different times he had inflicted damage, often collateral damage that haunted him, and also experienced what he said were some of the terrors and evils of war, specifically some of the acts that ISIS and Al-Qaeda had done before that he had either witnessed personally or been around. So for him, there wasn't any specific event that was a breaking point, but rather a combination of Shea's and Brett Litz's understanding of moral injury. And he seemed to have all these different instances. And what that did for him and a number of the others that I was deployed with is it caused them to go inward. As we know, it harms relationships. It made it harder for him to interact with his colleagues, with his spouse, with his 2 children. and also created this distrust in the entire military institution, the mission, and the people we were working with in Iraq. For me, this illustrates how moral injury is not only so detrimental in relationships, but it can be a singular instance that sticks with us for life, something that we've seen or done, or it might be a combination of a lot of instances that weighs upon our soul and affects our moral framework. To begin with, though, in my remarks, I want to think about moral injury partially today as relational and the relationship with the relational connection of humanity. Catholic theologian Karl Rahner sees that human nature itself is about being in relationship. And he says that by our very nature as finite, we find our ultimate fulfillment in God as the mysterious infinite. For him, the entirety of what it means to be human is about connecting with those beyond us, whether that's God or other people, and making that type of strong relationship. As another example, though, Paul Kurtz, a secular humanist who is not religious, he talks about something very similar, where he says that meaning in life is about in scientific advancement. It's connecting with and understanding the beautiful mystery beyond humanity, upholding the morals and values human can ascribe from their best knowledge of the day. For him, too, it's also about connecting beyond the self, connecting with others and connecting with our universe. That's what it means to be human. What moral injury does is it specifically disrupts our ability to connect and to relate to others. And in that connection, it causes anger, bitterness, malice, guilt, shame. It severs our connections and changes our identity from generally believing that we're somewhat moral and good beings to often feeling evil, tainted, or stained. So as I'm opening up the webinar today, I want us to think about the effects that moral injury has on relationships, which we often do in the literature, but then add in this idea of forgiveness. So how does forgiveness interact with all this? What I will contend and propose is that forgiveness helps to remove the impediments of relationship and connection. Forgiveness allows us to work through some of those direct results of moral injury in the process of reconciliation, reconnection, and bringing those relationships back to the forefront. In other words, in some ways, regaining our humanity. Last month, we talked about lamentation in our previous webinar, and how lamentation can be the first step in moving forward in the process of healing, relating that to some of the psychologists working in trauma and post-traumatic studies, and saying how the lamentation can be that step that allows us to begin to reconnect. In my own thinking, I see lamentation as often that first step in moving towards acceptance or forgiveness, and forgiveness often being that first step in reconciliation. The reconciliation of relationships, which allows us to then reconnect and find our humanness once again. So what types of relationships do we need to reconnect on? In my own thought, I see it in a threefold way. We have those which go beyond ourselves, like a vertical relationship, either to God for those who are religious, or to the general universe and the order of our world for those who are not religious. I see it horizontal amongst family, friends, colleagues, society, culture, as well as internal. We connect with ourselves, our values, our passions, our own hobbies, our identity of who we are. So from a vertical standpoint, those who are religious will often talk about with moral injury, either feeling that they're angry at God, or God's angry at them, or God's abandoned them. For the religious people, I think forgiveness works theoretically by starting with an identity of being a forgiven child of God. And the process we work on as those helping with people who are religious is often the process of some type of penance in order for them to accept the fact that they have been accepted by God. This is something that Paul Tillich often talks about, that even if God accepts us, the challenge is often us accepting that we are accepted, the process of that. But what happens if someone's not religious? Well, the first thing that I always like to do in my own counseling is start off by trying to ask, if someone's not religious, where does the guilt and the shame come from? Does it come from feeling that they have transgressed their own moral values? Does it come from the fact that they've transgressed the right order of the universe, of the way the world should be, or that they were taught it is? Is it almost like a karma thing where they feel like they've done bad and bad will come to them? Or is it more of an identity aspect where they feel they once were a good person, but now they've transgressed what's right and wrong in the world, and now they're a bad person? At this point, an approach that I will often take is trying to figure out exactly what that rub is, and then working with them to it to quote unquote set things right, to regain an identity that they often have, which has to do with forgiveness, acceptance, and then a regaining of moral integrity. So what I mean by this is many people who I've worked with often feel like even if they're not religious, there's a certain line or level out there in the universe. And once they've crossed it, they no longer feel that they themselves can identify as someone who is an okay or a good person. And then working with them to say, how can one regain your moral integrity? How can one set one right according to this moral understanding of the world, even if it's not based in religion? Often that comes with an outcome of a process that includes some types of good works. We think about service members flying back to the country in which they fought at times to do humanitarian work, working with other veterans at times. And this allows for an outcome often of self-forgiveness and regaining a moral identity. As we're offering or receiving forgiveness, this can often allow people to reconnect. But ritual itself can often be very helpful in this process of forgiveness as well. Ritual can provide the space for, the ground, and the depth of the process of reconciliation, where forgiveness is a key ingredient to that reconciliation. Here, I think of Mircea Eliade's work on the sacred and the profane, and how he specifically talks about space, time, and events can boundary the sacred from the profane, the ordinary from the special. And the idea that we should create these special moments of forgiveness, these things that are set apart from the ordinary, set apart in space and time, and the event themselves allows for this first act of forgiveness, which starts the process of reconciliation, which can then allow us to reclaim some of what was lost. We often think about this on the horizontal. I just talked briefly about the vertical, that beyond ourselves, whether it's religiously speaking with God or with a moral sense of the universe. But horizontally, we often hear service members talking about, I don't deserve my wife, my husband, my family, my friends, my children, or I'm tainted and I'm stained, or I don't deserve the respect of my colleagues. For this, we think about the person who might act as an agent who is seeking forgiveness through confession, through penance, and then through accepting of forgiveness of others, or someone who might be on the point of receiving forgiveness, and that forgiveness allowing them to release some of the bitterness and can restore relationship. On a personal and internal note, while it's often connected to the vertical and the horizontal, until we can either foster that moment of us seeking forgiveness or receiving forgiveness, we often are stuck with feeling that we cannot access our goals, our dreams, our passions, that we cannot really connect with ourselves. So even that aspect of self-forgiveness can be helpful for us to reintegrate as a full person. One last thought in these opening comments I want to leave us as we're opening up the conversation on forgiveness actually comes from Desmond Tutu. And he worked obviously in the area of forgiveness and crime and violence and all types of different challenges. But he said that no one has the right to tell someone who has suffered that he must forgive. No, we have to enter into the anguish of the one who has been made to suffer, to ameliorate and understand and sympathize with their suffering. The reason I leave us with that quotation is that while forgiveness, I do believe, is important for reconciliation, we should not demand that one either seeks out to forgive or to receive forgiveness, because that's obviously very personal to the individual. And the story I began with of the service member who felt that he was betrayed, that he had experienced immorality, that he had caused immorality in the world, for him, it was a process of identifying each one of those events and feelings that stuck with him, and coming up with moments where he could either forgive himself, forgive someone else, or do some type of action in which he felt that he might be forgiven. That moved him to a place of acceptance, to reconciling relationships, and eventually restoring his own moral identity and moral integrity as he felt was needed in the world in which he lived. And those are the opening comments I want to leave us with at this point, and I want to turn it over to our next presenter, and I look forward to further conversations on this topic as we move to the conversation part.
Good afternoon. I'm just grateful and honored to be included here alongside Christopher and Shelly and Nancy and be with you all today. As we continue to talk about fostering experiences of forgiveness among those affected by military moral injury, I want to first, in my remarks, challenge the idea that recovery from moral injury is about going back to normal. In 2020 and 2021, we've heard much about things getting back to normal, real desire for things to get back to normal, but we are generally beginning to accept that there is no going back to normal. The world post-COVID-19 is a new world, and I think this is analogous to the context of the global war on terror, and perhaps war in general in the experience of moral injury. There's not a return to normal or a journey back to before. War is the reality. It was not temporary, nor are its lasting effects temporary. Our shared reality is one in which war happened, one in which it is still happening. And I believe that before there's any experience of forgiveness or acceptance or healing or recovery from moral injury, we must first accept that the global war on terror and other wars before it were not blips on a timeline, not anomalies to the way things normally are, but that we live in a world ravaged by war. This happened, and it is happening. Moral injury, in a way, is a struggle to come to grips with or to accept the fact that the normal world includes war. There is no going back to a pre-war innocence, or as Larry Graham observes in his own book on moral injury, and I quote, "Healing from a lost innocence is not innocence regained. It is innocence mourned and moral integrity reestablished," end quote. I would personally go further than Graham and suggest that what we mourn as we come to grips with the reality of war is a lost illusion of innocence. Journalist Chris Chivers, in his book, The Fighters, I think names well the struggle to come to grips with the world that veterans of the global war on terror are going through. Chivers says, and I quote, "Veterans of recent American wars confront something pernicious, but usually invisible, the difficulties of trying to square their feelings of commitment after the terrorist attacks in 2001 with the knowledge that their lives were harnessed to wars that ran far past the pursuit of justice and ultimately did not succeed," end quote. The lives of veterans were harnessed to these wars in personal, concrete, and visceral ways. Nevertheless, all of our lives were harnessed to them. We all must live in this shared reality, one in which there is no going back to normal before the war, the forging ahead to something new. The first step, I think, in fostering any experience of forgiveness or acceptance. I must admit that in preparation for this talk, I struggled with the word forgiveness. For me, forgiveness involves rebuilding a relationship that has been harmed or damaged in some way. But it's very difficult for me to think of the people I encountered in Iraq back in 2004 as wanting anything to do with a relationship with me. We never had a relationship founded on trust or mutuality. I was part of foreign occupation of their country, an occupation that I agree with Chivers ran far past the pursuit of justice. The word that kept coming to my mind as I prepared for this is punishment. Punishment as an antonym of forgiveness. In my view, what stands in the way of experiences of forgiveness is a moral framework held by individuals and also exhibited nationally that's built on punishment. I want to take you back to the eve of the United States global war on terror, when George W. Bush opened his 9/11 speech stating, and I quote, "Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror." And then he closed his speech claiming that we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. End quote. In Bush's speech, good and just seem synonymous. They're raised in contrast to evil, despicable acts of terror. According to Origen, an ancient Christian theologian, goodness and justice should be considered synonymously. If a virtue is something good, Origen says, and justice is a virtue, undoubtedly justice is goodness. And he goes on to say, as we call evil and injustice one and the same wickedness, we should hold goodness and justice to be one and the same virtue. Origen was arguing with other ancient thinkers who distinguish goodness from justice. In his view, they misunderstood the concepts. And here's the rub for me. I'll quote Origen one last time. "For they think that justice is to do evil to the evil and good to the good. That is, according to their meaning, the one who is just will not show himself well disposed to the evil, but will behave towards them with a kind of hatred." End quote. I suggest that the global war on terror, framed as goodness and justice, involved also a kind of hatred, a system of punishment. We went forward to defend goodness and justice by punishing evil, and this led to our current reality, the difficulties in which we're trying to square our feelings of commitment after the terrorist attacks in 2001 with the knowledge that our lives have been harnessed to wars that ran past the pursuit of justice. And many of us are still locked into a framework of punishment, feel that we deserve punishment, and this forestalls any experience of forgiveness. I want to describe just briefly how the framework of punishment played out in Iraq in the early aughts. I draw from Thomas Ricks' book, Fiasco, Dexter Filkin's book, Forever War, and my own experience there. So daily, U.S. convoys would go on patrol, moving from one point to another on predictably dangerous routes. The U.S. military and Iraqis thought to be aiding the U.S. military were targets of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, vehicle-borne IEDs, and suicide bombers. Nightly, U.S. forces would conduct cordon and sweep operations, detaining thousands of Iraqis over the course of the counterinsurgency versus insurgency campaign, often unable to figure out who was of value and who was not. The tactic for reducing the daily attacks on convoys was detaining and questioning Iraqis. Sometimes units acted on tips, but sometimes they just detained all able-bodied males of combat age in areas known to be anti-American, often by kicking down doors and interrogating men in front of their families in the middle of the night, or hastily removing them from their homes. And this, predictably, led to greater animosity towards U.S. forces and more daily attacks. Safety and security were much needed after the invasion. What was delivered was a static pattern of domination and terror, a punishment machine, as infrastructure continued to fall into disrepair. This was the rhythm of the war as I knew it, a futile endeavor that involved much human suffering for a misbegotten notion of justice that was founded on punishment or a kind of hatred. How do we foster experiences of forgiveness from that? I fear I'm running out of time, which may be good because I don't have the answers, but I can only gesture now toward a kind of repentance that involves a shift in one's thinking and one's being, that people are not objects of punishment. Justice is not hatred. I think for many of us veterans who are struggling to come to grips with this reality, the cycle of punishment and hatred that was the war is now being played out internally. We punish ourselves. We hate ourselves in lieu of an absent party, the other, who was harmed and hated. And though we may recognize the cycle of hatred and punishment that is the war as absurd, it's still the framework to which we subject ourselves. For those of us who believe in a kind of God, we may feel deserving of divine punishment. Again, I can only gesture, but a road to forgiveness or acceptance for me, it requires abandoning this view, turning from it in a kind of repentance. We need not take the error of justice as punishment, that is the war, and project it onto God. To paraphrase a bit of Schleiermacher's theology, people are not the objects of divine wrath. God's justice is not a predisposition to punish people, but rather to reconcile with them. And that's all I have for now, and I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you, Chris and Michael. I'm really mindful of the gravity of the topic. I'm especially mindful today of the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. So when Michael's raising questions about how a nation remembers in issues of moral repair and forgiveness, I think these are even more weighty. So I'm just mindful of that anniversary. And I wanted to begin my comments where my journey with moral injury actually began, which was military moral injury. So I had the opportunity this week to just reflect on some of my experiences. And so I will begin with that. Peter is a Vietnam veteran. He shared these words with me in an email exchange when I invited him to share a bit more of his story. And these are his words. As that fire mission wound down, I experienced a physical, psychic surge from the crown of my head through my solar plexus. I felt a curtain drop through me, separating me before from me after. I felt I had sinned. Who I thought I was no longer. For who remained, I felt awe and dread. Peter sought various forms of treatment over a few decades and found many of them very helpful. But the concept of moral injury was really a turning point for him. It named something different from the host of diagnoses that he had received. Who I thought I was no longer. In 2012 to 2013, I had the privilege of sitting with Peter and a group of veterans in a healing circle. I was interested as a theologian in learning about healing and what it looks like, what it requires. This experience led to a set of interviews that now serve as the basis of my final chapter in a book I wrote, Resurrecting Wounds. I didn't end up interviewing the veterans. I hadn't planned on doing any interviews at all. But I was moved by the unusual configuration of this group. Many healing circles are closed to non-veterans. But this group, Warriors Journey Home, is committed to including what they call strong hearts, or people of strong heart, those pledging to wait and witness the journey of veterans to come to terms with the war experience. In these healing circles, things were spoken, but many things were not. The group, with its rituals, provided a holding space, a container for a lot of things to happen. I call it the important work of witness, a term theology shares with the therapeutic or clinical world, especially in the study of trauma. What does it mean to witness a veteran's journey home? How might non-military service members, particularly religious leaders and persons of faith, participate in the healing process? Forgiveness can be part of the journey home. And since I did those interviews, the study of moral injury has grown. Moral injury, more than trauma, places forgiveness at the center of discussions about how a person who has done or witnessed things that violate their sense of goodness can restore trust in the world and their ability to move in it. Within the clinical world in the VA, prospective treatments about moral injury and repair propose what we could call a secular process of forgiveness. They recognize the need for someone to come to terms with what they've experienced in war, and that coming to see oneself again as good may involve a benevolent figure who sees you as good, even when you cannot see yourself in that way. These things were once seen as religious roles with unique vocabularies and practices for making wrongs right. They were administered by priests, clergy, rabbis, or imams, collectively practiced on particular days, such as the Day of Atonement, the Night of Power during Ramadan, or the Sacrament of Confession in Catholicism. I believe that the therapeutic and religious understandings of forgiveness can interact and provide a deeply rich conversation about what it means to be human and what it means to be moral beings in a world that is morally complex and often morally compromised. I find the metaphors surrounding forgiveness more generative and helpful than the term itself. I agree with Michael on that. The term forgiveness can feel overloading or be an obstruction, actually, to think about moral repair. So I search for metaphors or synonyms for forgiveness for those reasons. The search for forgiveness is a human search for reconnection. The search to heal the ache in the human heart to be connected. And in documentary filmmaker Helen Whitney's language, to not go into the night alone. As a theologian, it's important for me to say that religious understandings of forgiveness can cut both ways, fostering a healing process, but also preempting a process of healing by often mandating an encounter or a particular kind of encounter between perpetrators and survivors. So I want to wrap a whole lot of caution tape around the concept of forgiveness. I am someone who's experienced teachings about forgiveness in its coercive forms and in its freeing forms. Pastoral theologian Larry Graham, whose name has already been invoked, calls forgiveness a complicated moral energy. It can be used, he says, to avoid accountability and to perpetuate harm. It can also bring release and relief. There are studies now about the impact of forgiveness on physical health and the benefits of letting go or releasing energies resulting from unforgiving states. With the caution tape still wrapped around forgiveness, I want to offer a few things to consider if you're interested or invested in fostering experiences of forgiveness. I'm assuming that the audience contains folks who are really interested in being witness or helping in care professions with those struggling with moral injury. So here are a couple things I want to offer. They're my caution tape offerings. First, forgiveness is a process rather than an event. So as Michael mentioned, this idea that there's an event that happens in which two parties come together to rebuild relationship, he couldn't imagine that really being possible. But forgiveness really is a process of coming to terms with or accepting what one has experienced. So moving, I think, from thinking about forgiveness as an event to forgiveness as a process, that often doesn't result in some form of like closure or ending. So for those working with coming alongside persons who are engaging, who have moral injury, reconsider the timeline of forgiveness. It's often nonlinear. It often doesn't have this imagined event that concludes one's process. Second, forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. We can probably have a vibrant conversation about that, but experiencing a process of forgiveness does not necessarily mean that one reconciles with the other party, right? Third, forgiveness is often framed in retributive rather than restorative terms. So if we think about forgiveness is often tied to forensic or legal metaphors, linking it to guilt and punishment. So a lot of the language is framed in terms of a judicial process in which the guilty make amends, or in economic terms, restore a debt that was owed. So this retributive tie to forgiveness, or common conceptions of forgiveness, can often reinstate language that doesn't facilitate a more relational process. So think about shifting from the retributive to restorative. Restorative justice models of forgiveness provide more texture, I think, to accept the complexities and justice issues that surround processes of forgiveness. And the fourth I want to just mention is something we could think about as the social determinants of forgiveness. So those of you in public health are thinking a lot about the social determinants of health. What are the environmental factors or conditions in which people are thriving or not thriving, right? How do we take those social determinants into consideration? Theologians would call this a deeply contextual analysis. When you're talking about forgiveness, you want to know, where are we talking from? Who are the communities we're talking about? What are the resources that they have in order to facilitate the process of military service members coming back into their communities? That's going to look different in Massachusetts than it does in South Carolina. It's going to look different in terms of the family configurations, ethnicities, etc. So think about where the questions about forgiveness are being asked and the social determinants that might impact that. Christianity, this is a tip back to Larry Graham and the rich offerings that he has in his book on moral injury. Christianity doesn't teach one thing about forgiveness, right? But it does teach strongly about forgiveness. So I'm aware as a Christian theologian that as much as I have tried to dodge really theologically thinking deeply about forgiveness, that in many ways it's not an option as a Christian theologian to wrestle with the complexities of forgiveness. And Larry writes, for Christians, moral living centers around forgiveness. So I hope this is a beginning of a conversation for me to take up the challenge to breathe new life into what are often prescriptive statements offered about forgiveness, shifting from more flat-footed questions like what does the Bible say about forgiveness, or should Christians forgive, to really thinking about the texture of biblical scenes and narratives, to offer connections between what I would call the human lived story, right? What are the stories that Chris is hearing? And how do we connect those stories to the ancient wisdom stories from wisdom traditions? Christianity is my kind of home base, but for folks in other religious traditions, to really think about how to connect the human story with what I would call the divine story. So stay close to the human story. That's what I'd say in closing. That's a good feminist theological commitment that I have to really think. If I think back to Peter, the words that Peter gave me, he's already giving me some of the imagery that he is using to understand who he once was, who he now is. So stay close to the human story. And as someone who works very closely with sacred texts, my commitment to really open up the biblical story. So preachers, teachers of these sacred narratives, how do you return, like I'm thinking of Michael as a preacher, he preaches weekly. How do you preach forgiveness? What does that mean to re-engage ancient texts, to kind of unpack really complex narratives around forgiveness? So I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
One thing that came to my mind, both Shelly and Michael, was this idea of forgiveness, reconciliation, restoration, acceptance, and the terms that we're using. And it made me think a lot about how forgiveness is not restoring a previous relationship, but it is possibly restoring one's moral identity. Forgiveness does not necessarily equal reconciling with another party, as we said, because sometimes reconciliation is never possible, but it might mean reconciliation in terms of accepting the reality of what has happened and accepting who both parties are. And that to me led a lot to the idea of we can't go back, as Michael said, we can't go back and create what once was because we have come past that. That's an idea that Stephen Joseph and some of the post-traumatic literature talks about, is broken vase theory. We can never create the vase once it's broken, but we can create something new and beautiful out of the original pieces. And how that might be taking the idea of repentance, a change in mindset, as Michael pointed out, in order to move from forgiveness into some form of acceptance and moving forward with what has happened. So just want to say thank you to both of you all for raising those nuances in the conversation of forgiveness.
Yeah, Chris, this is one of the things I thought it's important to bring out all the vocabulary of moral living. I found that really helpful to say, I think Warren Kinghorn says there are particular kind of Christian, a posture of patience, the practices of confession that you bring to this process of moral healing. But often forgiveness becomes the kind of juggernaut word in this process of moral repair, which is probably why Nancy chose it as a topic. But to really think, acceptance seems to be a reframing that many people can inhabit. I heard you use it. I think I'm curious about what Michael, what a path of acceptance, given what you said, looks like.
Yeah, I will just say I do think the word acceptance has more traction for me than forgiveness. I do think there's power in the word of forgiveness as reconciliation, but Shelley, I take your point that, and it's the point I made, that that's not what I think I'm talking about here with moral injury, especially military moral injury. It's not restoring a previous relationship, but I do think there's something to that. When there are two parties who did have a relationship that was founded on some shared trust, and something has damaged that there can be a process of restoration, maybe not going back to what was before. But I think I'm getting distracted here. But acceptance to me is something. Yeah, I just struggle with never having felt connected to the other. So there's language barrier. There's the barrier of power. There's all kind of barriers. Even while I was physically present in Iraq, that I was never connected. The connection was never severed because there was no connection. There was always walls there. So acceptance, I think, is something that can be done a little more solo, I guess, for lack of a better way. I can work on acceptance without that other party present, which is good because the other party is not present.
One thing that, just to kind of go off, that I've wondered about is we talked about how forgiveness often creates this release of something. And I wonder if for some people that release becomes necessary to move toward acceptance of whatever it is that they need to accept. And if that fostering this experience of forgiveness might be fostering that first step in order to release something, so we might be more open to move forward on our path of acceptance. Again, whether that's accepting something that happened to us or something that we did, or just something systemic to the situation that we're a part of.
So Chris, I want to respond to that because I was reviewing Larry's book again, as you could tell, and he says forgiveness can be offered as a resource. So it's interesting to think about, forgiveness is a process, forgiveness is an event, and I think Larry's invitation to think forgiveness might be a resource offered to, let's say, military service members as part of a process of coming to terms with their war experience. And I'm wondering what you think about that in terms of offering it. It's almost like a tool. I think clinically that floats pretty well, that forgiveness may be a resource to offer that release that could happen, to open up to, I would say, different new relationships, different capacities that you didn't have before, perhaps.
I really like the way you say that, as a resource. In my experience, that's how I've attempted to offer it, not as a prescription, which can have its own problems, as we know, but just as a resource to offer, specifically asking what would one possibly need to accept and what would one possibly need to be forgiven from, or to whom to forgive. I've seen that take the shape as a singular event in the form of a ritual, but then of course it's a process where it's not fully wrapped up in one instance. And that's where things such as letters, even to the people we don't know that never get sent, could be helpful through writing therapy. I've seen ceremonies in which an individual might have a religious service of confession and invite those who were either offended or who offended them, even though they weren't actually present. And that, I think, might fall into some of the different types of psychological therapy in which is currently being used as well. But yeah, as a resource, I think can be very helpful as an opportunity to release, but not as a prescription or mandate that must happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw a connection between that release idea and something you said from Tillich, I believe, Christopher, about the accepting that we're accepted. I just thinking that part of my own, this is anecdote, part of my own experience with moral injury is struggling with control, wanting to be in control, wanting to have all the agency. I'll explain what I mean by that a little. That sometimes even guilt and shame, holding on to these emotions is a way I hold on to control. And a release of that, I think, also involves, for me, maybe others, wrapped up in holding on to these kind of feelings and emotions is a kind of still an attempt to control the other, to imagine them as wanting to. It's almost like the other side of the error of forcing forgiveness on the other. It's like demanding that they punish me forever. Like it's attempting to just stay in control of the whole narrative, whereas this release of that, this accepting that we're accepted by someone, some other, kind of plays into that.
That's been my experience with a few service members I've worked with. Is the most challenging thing was either accepting they could be accepted by God, accepting they could be accepted by their spouse, or even accepting that what they did they could be accepted by their colleagues, their fellow soldiers, their fellow sailors or Marines. And part of the challenge was their own journey of penance to accept the acceptance that was always present. And that's something I would often talk with both the religious and non-religious about, is what will it take for you to be able to accept that which is already being presented to you? Not in a pejorative way, hurry up and do this, but in more of a uniquely human way, that it's going to take for all of us, I think, different things to get us to the place of even being able to release something. And that's always, when I'm working with individuals, a brainstorming that I start with them and just having that conversation. What do you think it would take for you to get to that place you could release something? And then we kind of let them lead from there.
I don't know if Michael wants to respond, but I was thinking about anger, a reframing of anger in theological traditions, of anger as a form of as a part of healing and coming to terms, that often forgiveness can try to, like, we're afraid of anger. This is the clinician could say a little bit more about that, but I was thinking about the need to keep control, but also the rage or anger about being caught in a relationship in which you have to do things that are like any way you turn, it's not clean or pure, right? So I'm wondering about all of the ways in which religious traditions, anger isn't usually part of the, like we talked about lament, but anger also, I think, has a form of release that is different than forgiveness, but might be also part of that repertoire of anger about what you were asked to do, anger about not being able, you had no relationship upon which, right, no relationship, no reparative possibilities in a particular sense. So I don't want to impose that on you, but I just was thinking about anger as a part of the process too, where it situates clinically, theologically.
I think I'm going to jump in here. And so I'm not trying to rescue you, Michael. I'm not going to command it, but we have there's some areas that I want to ask you all to pick up, maybe that we haven't pursued as much. And then there's certainly some questions from others. And one of those that I'd like for you to reflect on a little bit more is you've principally talked about a moral injury related to actions that one feels they have done. And I'd like for you to talk about receptive moral injury. And that is that others have done to them, and how they live with, what obligation do I have? And also, Michael, I remember, for example, one of your earliest essays, the one in Christian Century, where it may just have been the way I read it, but there was a certain anger about the vulnerability of the world, that the laws were all laid flat, that, and for some persons, depending on their faith frames, there could be an anger with God, that the world could be vulnerable to this kind of harm, that I wasn't protected from it, and went in with a sense that if I had lived a certain way, this couldn't happen, or that God wouldn't let this kind of harm, whoever the divine is, happen. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about how one walks with veterans when there's a sense of receptive moral injury, whether that is related to perhaps an unfortunately tight frame about who the divine is allowed to be and what the expectations were, but also if forgiveness comes because they feel betrayed by a commanding officer, they feel betrayed by fellow combatants, and ways they behave that they found highly problematic. Could you talk a little bit about that complexity, those kinds of complexities, I should say?
To whom is that question addressed?
Any of the three of you, whoever steps up. I was trying to be patient with that.
I'll not quite on the receptive moral injury yet, but on the anger raised by Shelly and by you, Nancy. I'll just say I still carry so much anger, and I don't feel like getting rid of that is necessarily part of my journey to healing. But I think this connects well back to the previous webinar about lament. Laments that, to me, can also be construed as a deep-seated anger. And if we're thinking of this as a process of lament as a step and forgiveness or acceptance as a step, I also think you don't just leave the lament behind as you include other parts of this process. But that the lament is going to stay there. It's going to echo out and be there. And that's what I had to add about that.
So they can be interwoven. So but does that mean that this is an ongoing process that they weave together and one is living with it?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. But others of you?
I think an instance, not specifically to combat that, reoccurred in some of the units I was with was actually sexual trauma relating to moral injury, specifically fighting side by side or at least with the same mission, but then being harmed by someone else in the unit or in a separate unit. And the feeling that of betrayal, as you mentioned, Nancy, but also the feeling that they experienced this terrible moral violation, and the guilt that then came of, how could I have let this happen? It might be my fault that this happened to me, and now that's hurting the mission, it's hurting what we're doing. In some of those cases, large investigations ensued that really damaged the command. Obviously, not the fault at all of the one who was violated, but the feelings of injury abounded. And that was even outside of the missions that were happening and the actual bombs that were being dropped at the time. So that to me became this very challenging web of the individual having been morally violated, but also feeling that it was her fault, but also feeling a part of a larger machine that was dropping weapons and punishing, as Michael put out, the enemy. And then how her role in that was affecting all these different areas. And that one became so layered that it was challenging to even disentangle and move toward lament or forgiveness, because it all seemed to just be one gob of immorality, if you will, in all different ways. And very little of any of that was her fault.
Right. Part of what you're describing, it makes me think of a fugue, and how these harmonies, they intersect, they recur. It's very complicated, and the ways in which emotionally that might be what the journey is like, when the complexity of harm and concern and and involvement are such as that.
And that's where I think it's really important to point out the circular nature. It's never a single event of forgiveness or lament, especially with the entanglement, but often it's the slow process of disentangling and addressing little by little as one has the capability to, and then coming back and addressing it again and coming back throughout a lifetime. And
yeah. And then, I'm sorry, Shelly, is there anything you want to add to this before I ask another
I
question?
was going to shift a little bit because there's some powerful stuff in the chat.
Yes, I'm watching it. Go ahead if you want to respond to
Is it
one.
okay if I shift a little bit?
Well, I have some more questions to ask you. We've got time to address those questions.
Okay.
But if one of those is intrigued where you want to respond, what I'm saying is go ahead.
Oh, I guess I was pointing to some of the productive tension between the clinical frameworks for moral injury and some of the theological responses or engagements with moral injury have really picked up on less on the individual process of forgiveness that a veteran would go through, and really turned, let's call it the move of Jonathan Shea, to think much more about collective civilian responsibility, I think the clinical or medical model, the telos is alleviation of suffering. I mean, I don't want to, that there's of, and I think religious traditions actually, I mean, on one side there's redemptive suffering, but on the other there's this notion, I think that Dr. Hilbert in the chat brought up about that there's something productive in the struggle with one's moral goodness, or I'm not the person I was before. I did these things, of coming to terms in a way that is not, telos, alleviation of suffering, but working in terms of some sort of moral integrity. So I think there's a tension there that I want to hold between often individual clinical frameworks that are important and valuable, but I'm interested also in what would a civilian process so that Michael's not walking alone, right? I mean, he's that what would it look like? And I know Chris Yandell does really substantive work on this at the VA in Philadelphia. Like, what would it look like for civilians to confess their participation and implications in war? What does that look like? So I guess I just wanted to point out that collective, I think theologically it's a more prophetic voice in the questions about forgiveness in its prophetic dimensions, about coming to terms with who we are as a whole, right? The whole cosmos in a relationship or web of moral living. And so it's not just one veteran, the theological is so much more cosmic. So, we could call it moral growth, but I'm interested in thinking about accompaniment in substantive prophetic terms about what collective forgiveness might look like.
Mhm, mhm. This is related, I think, to ways, again, with lament, but I remember, just to cite his name yet again, Larry Graham wrote a powerful article in the Journal of Pastoral Theology about public lamentation and the role of something like the Vietnam War Memorial, and the power. It's not just families of military folks who've died there, but many civilians that go there to grieve, that are remembering, or I think about the experience of folks that go to the memorial in Montgomery, and so I think there is, to my mind, you're raising up what some others have also joined, that part of forgiveness is how do I revise behavior? And of course, part of the ownership is that in a democracy, I voted for the folks that sent persons to war, whether that war was moral or not. I'm implicated. There's another relationship, another issue that I want to raise, that our friends in Judaism remind us that from their perspective with forgiveness, one has to act, one has to do something that is proportional to the harm that one did. And so, we may not want to go deeply into that path, but it does lift up that there are, persons bring different conceptions of, and different traditions have different conceptions of what would be required. So I wonder if there's further any reflection about that.
I might jump in here. Michael said at the beginning that we're often stuck in this punishment system and the idea of forgiveness relating to punishment. And then Shelly pointed out that forgiveness must be restorative. So I think one way we can start to frame that is not in the sense of what do you have to do to be forgiven, but what do you have to do in order to restore your moral integrity? Mm-hmm. And using that idea of forgiveness as a process of restoring moral integrity or moral identity. Mm-hmm. And that can get away from this retributive punishment, justice idea of you have to do this because of this, and more toward you can do this to restore yourself. And again, not back to the way you once were before, but to create something new that is more human.
So there can be a connection with the acknowledgement of the harm, the guilt about it, and what actions, that can be part of the lament process that leads one to be clear about, well, I can't change that, but what I can do this. Exactly. And before we jumped on, we talked a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And I had an opportunity to work at a church out there for a period. And they would say again and again that forgiveness often was the ability of the family who had had something terrible done to them to be able to say and state and acknowledge what had happened in order for them to find acceptance and to move forward. Mm-hmm. And that it actually had nothing to do with restoring a relationship with the offender. And it had all to do with the individual being able to move forward in acceptance. And mm-hmm. I wonder if that points to Michael's point of we don't always need to have a relationship, as many of those families didn't, but had to speak their truth and have it be acknowledged by witnesses in order to move forward. And it wasn't even always forgiving the offender for what they had done, but finding some form of reconciliation of acceptance, not restoration of the past. Right.
One of the things that I'm back to your receptive moral injury question, because I found my way back. I find that receptive moral injury so helpful, and I used to think, well, isn't that just trauma, right? So having things done to you, but I think this receptive moral injury is naming something in relationship to military moral injury, but also the bigger climate that Michael's reminding us of is ongoing wars, right? So the soul of the nation, if you could say. And I think the notion of more receptive moral injury is that to some degree our moral imagination, our moral horizon has been diminished. And let's say diminished over time. So as wars kind of, I'm thinking of myself as a civilian. Oh, we have a war going on, right? From mission creep to kind of an invisibility in public life about war. That over time, the diminishment of our capacity to imagine ourselves not at war or differently, receptive moral injury seems really productive there, because I think there's, thinking outside of the war context specifically, there's been a kind of more diminishment of moral horizon writ large, right? And I think it happens so slowly that I barely notice the lessened ability I have to feel like a morally good actor in society. It's all so complex, right? It's all so overwhelming. We're in the midst of racial reckonings and pandemics and ongoing wars. But I really think that civilians, thinking about our diminished capacities to imagine the world is good, that's a real thing. And so what would it look like then to address particular harms in that context? I may have gone just very cosmic, but I think the receptive moral injury is a way of naming civilian participation. That's really, we don't really think about the impact much.
Well,
maybe that's testimonial. I mean, we do in this room, but.
I think that we need to turn to some of the questions very quickly from the chat. One of the things that I wanted to lift up was that concept of ambiguous loss, which I know you're familiar with, that Pauline Boss writes about, but I think it's relevant to the journey, not some sort of resolution, forgiveness as resolution, but as a process, as a journey. And of course, she talks about the particular vulnerability of persons for whom what is right and wrong are clear and definite, and how precarious it becomes then for a person who encounters the fact that many things are not so clear, it strikes me that that part of ambiguous loss, as she says, is if one can deal with ambiguity, the journey is a bit easier. One of our observers, one of the folks on this webinar, has said, this is a process. This is not like you get it, once and done and you're forgiven. But that's too my experience with talking with veterans, that there might be some adequate resolution, so they re-enter the world and with some sense of integrity, etc. But it's not like those experiences that they witnessed or in which they were involved are, resolved and erased. I think, Michael, I've also learned that from you. If you want to nod, or do you want to say something?
I was nodding. I was thinking of, we're going to turn to questions in the chat. I was about to go down a rabbit hole, and I'm going to back up and not do that.
Well, we've engaged a number of them, but anger is certainly one of the things that folks raise, anger, and that anger can be at more than a particular instance, but the fact that one was called into a war that, as some would say, makes no sense, that it altered not only your life, but the civilians who were harmed, that you see the mess that human beings can make. So let's talk a little bit, the point is raised about anger and the complexity of that enduring anger, because it's more than something you can resolve just about your own behavior. How, Chris, I'm wondering, as you work with veterans, how does anger complicate one's journey with some sense of being able to forgive oneself, if that's the struggle, or with others if it's a receptive moral injury?
I think that's a great question. And anger and ambiguity actually together, I think, are very complicating, because often, at least in my experience, I'll find someone who feels anger that they were put in a situation, but also maybe guilty for what they participated in, even if it wasn't directly their fault, but then also anger at what maybe the enemy had done, and then a frustration about something else. And that ambiguity, I think, then brings up, do I have the right to be angry? Should I be angry? If I am to foster an experience of forgiveness, do I need to forgive them, or do they need to forgive me, or do I need to forgive myself? And as we're asking these questions with the convergence of different moral ambiguity or morally ambiguous pressures or challenges, it makes it very challenging, I think, for one to even feel affirmed that they could be angry, or that they need to be forgiven, or who they are. And that entanglement, I think, has become very challenging. And that's where, as has been pointed out in the chat, patience can be helpful, for where one just states where they are, and then we have patience as they start to work through it.
I also think about the work of folks like Zachary Moon that talk about the importance and the healing power of providing strategies for veterans who continue to work out, regret about the harm they were entangled in, and to be able to come back and really contribute from the strengths that they know they have for their community. That is, that one can, you can't undo some of what has been done, but you can certainly, as he writes, provide, invite veterans to use the strengths that they have to be constructive in various points in their communities, or traveling, as some do after disasters, to rebuild houses and so forth. So there, a way to work out some of those feelings by being a part of healing for others. Does that ring true for some of you all?
Just real quick, that's where I would say acknowledging and affirming that it's okay to be angry at an aspect, and also feel guilty about another aspect, and also feel sad or full of grief about another aspect, and acknowledging or affirming that you can have all of those and be right in feeling all those, because of the multi-layer complexity. And then as you're working through it, as you said, Nancy, you can address and experience those different aspects of it as you're working through.
I was thinking of that, connected to Michael's statement about anger, gave me a sense also of being in control. And I think this is connects to the concept, to the idea that you mentioned about strength, right? Is that often forgiveness or certain things that are offered may underscore a sense of weakness. So I'm wondering about how with veterans we can move with them through from a position of strength, so that it's not about control or giving up control, but about, I'm thinking very somatically here about programs that work trauma out of the body. It's about physical release. And something about the process in Judaism about action above profession, right? We're waiting or giving a profession of forgiveness or some sort of statement made, making amends may seem very domesticated. But I'm wondering, working forgiveness as an action of releasing from the body what needs to be released is a position of strength, right? And that anger seems to be really productive in that sense. When this is Peter Levine, when the animal is pinned down, what the animal needs to do is release the energy. So maybe we can think of forgiveness as, levels of a kind of strengths-based approach to healing, less profession, more action, less dogma, more using the body. This is very somatic oriented. To think Cheyenne, the veterans group that I worked with, when Cheyenne Eagleheart was leading that group, she would take vets out to like play sports, right? It's like, what do the veterans need to do? They need to like play competitive sports and do very somatic practices. So we don't often think of that coupled with forgiveness, but maybe we need to reframe forgiveness in terms of some of this, anger plus a more control-based starting points or stages of healing.
Well, I think whether one is playing a sport and just engaging, feeling the strength of one's body and engaging others, or whether it's I can't undo what I did, but I can build a home.
That's right.
I can rebuild a home that's been destroyed. I can build a park for kids, and I can't help the kids that I left back in Mosul, but I can help my own. It's like I can give back. One of the things that are some of the folks in the chat are talking about is what do we learn about ourselves as a result of moral injury? And I think that's part of related to what we've been describing. I think, let me invite you to respond to that, but I think we're talking about that this is a lifelong war involves us in some in harm that can't be undone, and whether that's to us or to others, but how does that then, how do we go on living with some way that is not just utterly broken?
I'd like to jump in here and attempt to clearly articulate something I've tried to jot down as I'm listening. But
Okay.
To that point, and to the topic of anger, and some other thoughts I've seen in the chat. I haven't seen them all, but there's in both agential and receptive, but in different ways. I think both these types of moral injury, there's a recognition, there's a sort of expansion. As I know Shelly mentioned the diminishment earlier, but there is a learning about our world and a learning about ourselves. And the first story Shelly shared about the person who says, "Who I thought I was no longer." I think receptive moral injury. I think of Susan Bryson's book Aftermath all the time. It's so powerful, and she talks about her own trauma as this world-rending event, and I think there's anger there. There is an anger when other people don't see that the world is this world where violence is taking place. That this didn't just happen to one person. You live in this world too, where people can be raped or people can be killed. And I would expect, I think of systemic racism in our own country the same. I can imagine those who experience this every day, the anger that, why can you not see that this is a reality? So I just wanted to connect those threads a little bit. So that yeah, there is something learned. I think, and I don't know what to do with that anger other than to try to persuade people, convince them, tell the story. Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, a beautiful piece. In the end of that book, he says he's writing to save his younger self's life. And so I don't know if the art of writing it itself does that, or if people reading it and sitting with it does that, but it's really beautiful, and something puts that truth into the world in a way that's healing. I'll stop. I've heard myself talk a lot. So,
Chris, I was thinking about chaplain's privilege of journeying with veterans, and thinking about that if it's an ambiguous, if it's a journey, and one has to live, you can't undo some things. You can hopefully alter the weight of it, and the way it might inhibit the possibility of continuing on in life with any sense of positiveness. And I'm wondering, where is that point if you're working with a veteran when you feel as if he or she has come to a place where it's tolerable. They're going to be able to re-engage the world and have an adequately positive sense of themselves to step back into life. What's a clue for you that someone has reached that point?
That's a very challenging question, as it's obviously very unique to each individual. In some ways, though, I think in my own experience, it's been as simple as just kind of asking them. I think that, as was commented in the chat before, a lot of people, you can't rush people in their journey. And when people feel that they are ready to step forward, they often start to feel that release and that ability to begin to reconnect. So for me, it's when I start to observe the capacity within one to begin to reconnect with their God, or that if they're not religious, that which is beyond us, with their family, with their friends, reconnect with themselves, their passions, that I think that they're on that helpful road. With that, the strand I want to connect is, as Michael pointed out, sometimes we feel very angry that no one understands, and it can be a very lonely place with moral injury. And that's what makes the challenges of communal forgiveness, as numerous authors, including Edward Tick, talk about, are so important, very challenging. And then think about this with the pandemic and how isolated we all have been in the last few years.
That's
just contributing more to that, which then only reinforce the anger and the challenges of reconnection, which is often that important step toward healing. Or the grief, which becomes more isolating. In my experience, there can be ritual processes that, when one engages in them, at least creates some sort of transition. It may not be everything's fixed, but it can mark a point. I tried to signal that in the chapter I wrote in the book with Carrie, that where this veteran has written a lament, and he buries it at the community garden that he is now again taking on as part of something he can give back to the community. But so it's not like everything's fixed, but he can recognize something's shifted, maybe, is a better way to put it. And I agree with you. VA chaplains have told me that COVID has made it very difficult for veterans who were getting together with each other, and then it was too dangerous to do that. And I think pastors or rabbis, imams, need to be aware of the challenge of isolation for older veterans who still live with these memories. And real quick, Nancy, if I could just add, we can't forget how so much of the military are people of action. As Shelly pointed out, sometimes it's physically doing something. Most of our military prefer to do rather than to sit and think. And that's where, to your point, physically doing things helps connect us and moves us forward, whether that be writing a lament, burying a lament, going somewhere, building something, some form of action.
One of our panelists talks about morality as, endurance, strength, aesthetics, that morality can be relative to context and the things we learn, and hence the image of journey. But one of the things that pastoral theologians have certainly talked about, Andy Lester in particular, that hope is relationally sustained, that it isn't something that, at least from a Christian perspective, and I think in general, it is sustained in relationships. So without it being saccharine. So I think this is partly, what some veterans find helpful in circles that such as Shelly was studying and participating in. But it also makes it important for those of us that might be in various faith communities to be mindful of that community itself as a resource. We have come to the end of this. I'm grateful for the strengths, for the questions that folks asked. I tried to fit them in. And we thank you, three of you, very much for sharing as you have. And for those of you that have been watching and know there've been lots of folks cited, and you're looking forward to hearing this again and thinking seriously about it, it should be on the link in about 10 days at the most, along with bibliographies. Thank you all very much, and we hope to see you back in September.